Okay, so we're live again for PCR 13. Uh, that's peace and security in the global context. We have been trying to understand or conceptualize peace security studies in the past couple of weeks. So today we're going to move to another topic. We're going to move to uh, conflict and internally displaced persons. We're trying to understand how conflict factors in the whole uh, ecosystem of peace and security as regards internally displaced persons. Now, it is quite common that in every conflict at all, there is generated a level of displacement of human beings. And when this displacement involves or cuts across borders, we refer to these people as refugees. So when there's a conflict and people are displaced, but the displacement is not local, it's not restricted, or let me say, it's not largely within the borders of a country, but spews into the borders of another country. That becomes an international issue, and those people are referred to as refugees. However, if we have displacement of people within the borders of that same country or state, as the case may be, these people are referred to as IDPs, internally displaced persons. Now, this whole phenomenon in which conflict occurs, whether a war, or some other type of low-level conflict, whenever such conflicts occur and people are displaced, the risk of the re-emergence of conflict is very high. And also there are several other factors that impact on the immediate society, immediate community, the immediate nation within which we have the incidence of internally displaced persons, which go a long way in affecting peace, transcending local to international peace. So we can see that whenever IDPs are created, there's a vast amount of impacts that this particular phenomenon has on the nation, on the locality and community in which these particular incidences are taking place. So what I want us to do in this topic is to quickly look at some of these impacts and how they relate to peace building, and international relations as a whole. Now, to start with is resource competition and social tension. Would discover that usually when people are internally displaced, they are usually uprooted from their immediate locality, their original locality, the land in which they are originally located in or planted in. Now, this particular displacement separates them from the resource of their livelihood. Let's assume that they are farmers, for instance. Let's take that, let's use that assumption that they are farmers. So the moment these people are uprooted from their farmland, that means they do not have access any longer to the stable water, firewood, grazing land, farming land, livestock, which had initially sustained their livelihood. They are removed from their school, healthcare, other forms of facilities. Now, once they are removed from this immediate supply of resources, they are pushed into another location in which they now have to compete for the resources. All these resources that I mentioned, they now have to compete for the resources that were domiciled in that location for the residents of that location. Because internally displaced persons, by description of the word, are displaced internally, not internationally. They are displaced from their original location into another location. So this is usually the first problem, very serious problem. competition for resources now arises once they now shift to the other location and then swell the population of that particular location. And once the population of that particular location swells, tension begins to rise. And this tension can very easily, create another cycle of violence. Because once there's competition for resources amongst human beings, the likelihood that conflict will emerge from that competition is usually very, very high. People may end up fighting over these resources, grazing rights, housing, social services, farmland, water resources, healthcare services, schools. Why? Because they are become compressed within a particular locality as a result of the fact that some numbers of that population were displaced from another location into the new location. Now, number two is the fact that the amount of criminality and exploitation amongst the displaced populations now rise. They now begin to, uh, present themselves in a position that is very vulnerable to people who would want to exploit them. We've heard severally of young girls being raped in IDP camps, women being taken advantage of, young boys also being taken advantage of, and generally the demography of internally displaced persons are very vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation, economic, political, social, and even spiritual exploitation. We've seen this happen in several instances. And usually one of the levels of exploitation that is always very high is that of trafficking. Okay? Then you now also have sexual exploitation. Usually when people find themselves in these circumstances in which taking care of themselves, taking care of their livelihood and their families become very tough, they are pressured into going into certain things that under normal circumstances they would not have gone into, or making agreements or exposing themselves to certain conditions that under normal circumstances they wouldn't have done. So this makes them quite vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation. So this is one of the critical impacts that conflict that gives rise to IDPs usually have on the local population, the internally displaced population, not just the internally displaced population, but the population which is the host of the IDPs. Usually the pressure is two-way. The pressure, coming from the IDPs, also there, creates a mirror effect on the local community that is hosting, the IDPs. Now, number three, we also need to look at the factor of weakening of traditional governance. Because of mass displacement, because of mass displacement of people, this disrupts traditional social structures and authority systems, not just within the IDPs, but also the host communities, like I said earlier. So when the structures are broken down or weakened at the most, conflict resolution mechanisms become very difficult to arrive at, because we have a situation whereby the society is largely in chaos. Everybody is focused on survival rather than trying to resolve local conflicts among themselves, and usually because either the traditional rulers and the vigilante, what we call communities, security systems are absent or dysfunctional. At that point, there is a power vacuum. Power vacuum is created that is usually filled by criminals and armed groups. Once the traditional, authority structures are not are either weakened or displaced or not in place, you see criminality coming in at this point, to fill in that void, that power void. And rather than ameliorate the plight of IDPs, this worsens the situation. And once this worsens the situation, it makes resolution of peace quite difficult, rather than moving the community towards resolving or mitigating some of the factors that led to the initial conflict. It worsens the situation and even creates room for future forms of conflict. Because whenever armed groups and criminal gangs networks come into place of power, the likelihood of tensions and conflicts arising, becomes very, very high. Now, number four is the fact that in every single instance in which people are internally displaced, they lose track of the standard health services that should be available to them. Not just health services, but also other forms of social services. And this results into, most instances, public health crisis. You begin to have diseases like dysentery, and because of the choked atmosphere, environment in which they have to live, the spread of some diseases, contagious diseases, becomes very fast. Prior to this, when they lived in their own environments that were quite spacious and comfortable, these situations, this public health crisis, did not arise. But because of the cramped atmosphere and environment in which they are now compelled to live, we find out that in most cases, public health crises usually emerge because once they live in these kind of conditions, we discover that social amenities are usually not available. There isn't enough water for washing, cleaning, toileting, so on and so forth. Most of the times, you don't even have enough toilets to go around. So the environment becomes, very, very dirty, and breed mosquitoes and other forms of potential situations for different kinds of diseases to emerge. So a public health crisis in IDP camps is very, 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 very common under the circumstances whenever we have a situation, that the IDPs, the people have been displaced and have become IDPs within another environment. Now, these are impacts on the immediate community, the immediate locality. But what about the state? Because we have three levels in which impacts, can be analyzed and be looked at. The local level, amongst the IDPs and their host communities, and also among the state, within the state structure itself, the state in which we've had this conflict, and the internally displaced persons have emerged. Within that particular structure, we have several. Number one, is pressure on state legitimacy and capacity. Does the state have the capacity to be able to handle the problem of internally displaced person? That's number one. The state is usually under pressure. We see Nigeria, for instance, under pressure for resources, for capacity, for manpower, to handle the problem of IDPs. There's been a lot of criticism on how, the IDPs are being handled, they're not being taken care of, and even, some foreign organizations are be able to lend a hand, but because there is no proper capacity to be able to handle the entire problem because it's so vast. The IDPs are spread wide across the Middle Belt and some parts, of the North. And as a consequence of this, the legitimacy of that state is put into question. Some people talking about Nigeria, as a failed state. Of course, Nigeria isn't a failed state, but you can see because of things like this, question marks are raised over the capacity and legitimacy of that state in handling its internal affairs. Number two is the fact that militarization and recruitment of IDPs become very, very heightened. That means within the cohort of IDPs that have spread across different communities, armed groups are more likely, to source, for members within these internally displaced persons camps. Why? Because these people are under a huge and incredible amount of social economic pressure. They lack money, they lack livelihood. The state doesn't have capacity to take care of them. So usually they have a lot of grievances, and they can very easily be convinced to join groups that probably have attempted to convince them that they will be able to redress their situation. So they are vulnerable to militarization, to recruitment, because of the unique situation in which they find themselves. Now, number three is the dynamics in the peace process. Now, usually, political and humanitarian claims that are made by IDPs must be addressed, in any peace negotiation, regarding their land, rights, return back to their land, compensation, things like that. So neglecting these issues can create a disenfranchised population that becomes a spoiler that oppose peace processes. So if the population of IDPs are not properly compensated, and then their humanitarian claims and issues are not taken care of, they themselves may not begin to pose a problem to the peace process. Because how can you arrive at peace when there is no justice? That's the reason why we usually attempt to bring a truth and reconciliation commissions most of the time in post-conflict environments, in order to placate the populations that were displaced internally, they were affected, they were brutalized, that were killed, that lost land, lost loved ones, so on and so forth. And this whole process, this dynamic in peace process, is critical in order to manage IDP populations and make them, amenable to a peace process. Finally, within that same context, we'll look at the fourth factor, which is the extended control of armed groups. Now, the situation is that in some cases, armed groups actively prevent the return of IDPs to areas they control, using displacement as a tool to alter the demographic composition of a region, a form of ethnic cleansing, which is what we are seeing in the Middle Belt and some parts of northern Nigeria, in which large swaths, of Christian populations are being displaced completely, and these groups are looking for every way possible to prevent them from returning back, to their original lands. Peace is very critical to the peace process. If these people are prevented from returning back to their lands, it becomes very difficult to push forward a peace process, because it becomes obvious that the conflict in itself does not have basis of resolution, because the basis of resolution is returned back to the status quo. The meting out of justice, the working out of justice, truth, reconciliation among the two groups. Now, if that is not properly handled, we discover that the conflict is more likely to extend and persist within that particular region over a long period of time.